OU took the first MPSF title since 2021. Michigan took their fifth Big Ten title in a row. And Army upset Navy to take their first ECAC title since 2016. For those new here, I'm Kensley, the host of Neutral Deductions, a podcast all about men's gymnastics. This is episode 65, where I recap the NCAA Conference Championships plus Elite news. So we're going to start with the Big Ten Championships, which was the only of the three championships that used a 2-day format and also that was on podium. So Michigan actually started in Olympic order, so they would have been the highest ranked of the teams who competed. They would have gotten first choice, how they wanted to start, and so teams often choose different strategies. So sometimes they want to go in Olympic order because that's what they do most often throughout the season as the host team is starting on floor. Some teams choose to go on pommel horse first because they just want it absolutely out of the way. Stanford really likes to start on vault first for some reason. That's kind of been their pattern. So each team, whoever gets to choose first, often has a different reason for choosing a different starting order. So Michigan chose to start on floor, and what was really exciting to see for them was that Paul Judah was back in the lineup. So this was his 2025 season debut in the all-around and obviously on floor, and he actually got the highest score of the night with a 14.25 on floor, but that wasn't the floor final, that was qualification. So just a little clarity on the format. So night one for Big Tens was team final and all-around final, and then it also served as qualifications for event finals, which happened the following night. So the all-around fight for Michigan, it really was down between Paul Judah and Frederick Richard, who were, of course, the two Olympians. And actually, it was really close throughout the meet until the final rotation. And Paul Judah just faltered on high bar, and Frederick Richard actually performed exceedingly well. He got a 14.1. It was a beautiful routine. And they did end up finishing 1-2 in the all-around and truly helping lead Michigan to victory. So Michigan ended up with a 330.750, which was the highest score of any of the teams who competed in this entire weekend, regardless of the conference that they were in. And they also went on to ultimately win their fifth straight Big Ten title. So during this meet, I had actually expected the battle to be really close between Michigan and Nebraska, but Penn State, in my opinion, pulled the upset on Nebraska thanks to a couple really big scores by Ian Roybal on still rings and parallel bars. And then in their final rotation, Michael Artlip and Matt Cormier getting the sticks and just coming in clutch and allowing Penn State to sort of slip into that second spot. So for Nebraska, the Cornhuskers rounded out the team podium. They took bronze, and they were led by Taylor Christopoulos, who was named Big Ten Gymnast of the Year, and he also took bronze in the all-around. So Nebraska had a couple of really big highlights. They took the highest score of any team on floor and on still rings, but they had a really poor performance on pommel horse, and their good performances just weren't enough to overtake their poor performances. They weren't a team that I was expecting to be in the fight for that title contention, but I did think that they could get on the podium. They knew based on their rotation order, so they were starting on still rings, which isn't necessarily one of their strongest events. So they knew that they would be starting in a deficit, but they actually were able to vault up the standings on vault with Garrett Chuli's season high 14.7, and they had a really stellar rotation, and they were in second place following the second rotation. But ultimately, they ended up having to count a fall on high bar, and they finished just off the podium. And then we have to spend a moment and talk about Ohio State. So Ohio State wasn't expected to win, but they also weren't expected to finish 15 points off of Michigan either. So this meet was really confusing. It seems like maybe they're having trouble with some of their lineup selections due to some injuries, and they just couldn't get it together. It was their lowest scoring meet with the exception of their very first meet of the season, and I would kind of categorize it overall as a disastrous performance. And I think that they're going to be heavily looking for redemption when they come back to Ann Arbor for the national championships in 2 weeks. night one, the standings were Michigan, Penn State, Nebraska, Illinois, and Ohio State, with Frederick Richard winning the all-around title, followed by Paul Judah and Taylor Christopoulos. So for night two, there were event finals, and there were a few things that just weren't surprising. So Brandon Dang winning pommel horse was the most likely outcome for sure. Cameron Nelson won vault. Again, I would say that was pretty likely. And then Joshua Carnes winning parallel bars. Each of these athletes have been ranked either number 1 or number 2 on these events for the majority of this season. Now, I thought the floor final was going to be really, really close and interesting. You know, I think a lot of people have been touting Charlie Larson this year with his big tumbling coming from a trampoline and tumbling background. And there are just several really top name athletes in this final, and it was Jesse Piquel of Ohio State who came away with a 14.075, which is a really good score on this event. Some other surprises-ish was Yanni Chronopoulos of Nebraska taking the top spot on rings. Now, Nebraska actually took the top 4 spots on rings in the event final, which is really cool. And I think it's also representative of why they had the highest still ring score in the team competition. And then for the high bar final, I think everyone thought, okay, maybe Frederick Richard's going to take this title. I don't believe he actually ended up choosing to compete in this final. It was actually his teammate Evgeny Semeniuk who took the high bar title with a score that equaled Frederick Richard's score from night 1. So some other notes to just be aware of. There were some problems with the judging angles. So as I mentioned earlier, the Big Ten competition is the only of the conference championships that happens on podium. And when you have a podium competition at the World Championships, typically the judges are raised up higher. So they are like at level and they're not staring up into the lights and they're able to see deductions a little bit better. But what happened at the Big Ten championships, and I believe what is also happening at the NCAA championships, is the judges are on the floor. So they're looking up at these really bright lights that they have to have for TV cameras. And that causes a couple of issues. So one is that in the NCAA, athletes are able to wear darker pants. And so if you can wear darker pants and you're looking up into the light, it makes it really hard to see leg separation deductions and some angle deductions. So I think that there were a couple of scores at Big Tens that, well, athletes got the benefit of it, but I think like overall maybe they weren't as competitive of scores as they needed to be. I hope that this is something that's going to be rectified for the NCAA championships, because some of these teams are going to be so close that these tenths really do matter. And I know the judges want to do their best to give the most accurate score, but I do know that this was particularly a problem. I do want to say overall at Big Tens, I was really pretty happy with the judging. I felt the parallel bar judging was a little loose, to be honest. For example, like Ian Roybal getting a 14.6 on parallel bars in the team final. Like the highest score in the world internationally is a 14.550 from a Japanese athlete who competed at DTB Cup. Like even though they're different rules, it was just a little high. So I would like to see a P-bar score come down in line with some of the rest of the other judging for the NCAA championship. But overall, I felt that the judging there was quite good. Moving on to the MPSF championships, which took place in Colorado Springs. This was just a one-day event in the regular gym competition setting. So the Sooners won their 20th MPSF title, but it was their first since 2021. And the Sooners were actually dominant from start to finish. Now, what I was really interested to see at this meet was that the Sooners had chosen to start on vault, and being the number 1 ranked team in the country, they were of course going to get first choice of where they started. And typically I feel like Oklahoma typically starts in Olympic order. And when they chose to start on vault, I just like had in the back of my mind, I wonder if they're doing this to mess with Stanford. And like I can't, I could never say that for sure, and there's no confirmation, but they don't typically start on vault because having to end on rings, right, it requires a lot of strength. And I don't know, but I would be really interested to know if they did that just to mess with Stanford. And if they did, it seems to have worked because they did actually end up winning the meet. So the meet ended up being quite close. It came down to 3/10 of a point, which is about a medium error. And neither team was perfect throughout this competition. But ultimately, what's really interesting is Stanford could not capitalize on their over 6 points of difficulty advantage. So I actually ran the numbers, and if I'm correct with everything, Stanford had a 6.2 difficulty advantage over Oklahoma, and they lost the meet. And this is really telling that difficulty, it's not everything. And so I'll be interested to see how much Stanford can clean up between the MPSF championships and the NCAA championships as well. So for the other two competitors, Air Force and California, they were honestly never in the running for the team title, but both of them had really historic success for some of their individuals. So Eric Upton of Air Force won the all-around title, which is the first for Air Force, so the first ever MPSF all-around champion. Patrick Hoops won his first conference pommel horse title, and I believe Air Force has had 2 previous pommel horse MPSF winners. And then for California, their Jasper Smith Gordon became the first ever vault champion since 1987. So well done to them. And as I mentioned earlier, there wasn't a separate day for event finals, so it was just this one day of competition that awarded the event final winners. So for floor, Taylor Burkhart took first there, and I think that that's right in line with how he's been performing all year. He also won a gold medal at the Entire World Cup. Patty Hoops topped the field for pommel horse. It was an incredibly deep field, definitely the deepest pommel horse field of any of the meets this weekend, including Coy Young, who was there, Aiden Lee of Cal, and Ignacio Yakers of Oklahoma. I would say for still rings, as long as he hit, there was no doubt that Asher Hong was going to be the MPSF still rings champion. And I would say as long as he hits at the NCAA championships, there is no one who is going to challenge him for that NCAA title as well. I would say that Jasper Gordon-Smith is a bit of a surprise, especially considering Asher Hong did the Rise Guang. And, there's several other really strong vault athletes that were ranked ahead of him, including Taylor Burkhart and Eric Upton and names like that. Fuzzy Benes has recently returned to OU from injury, and he took the parallel bar title. And then Emery Donnelly has been stellar on high bar all year, and he capitalized on his number 2 standing in the nation to become the MPSF high bar champion. Now, there were a couple other interesting things that happened at the MPSF championships. We'll go interesting bad first. So I noticed that there were a couple of sticks that happened at the MPSF championships that didn't get awarded stick bonuses. I have been told that the input system wasn't working quite right at the MPSF championships. This has to be rectified for NCAA championships. There cannot be judging pads that don't work, or there has to be a way to add it later, because again, I think it is very possible that this championship is going to come down to tenths, and if we're missing stick bonuses, that's a problem. The other hilarious thing, and we'll call it hilarious good thing, was the case of the lost trophy. So Mark Williams, who is the Oklahoma coach, has been documenting this on X or Twitter, however you like to call it, and it's been really funny. So apparently everyone kind of got on the bus thinking, someone has the trophy, and it turns out that no one had the trophy. So some of the Air Force men's gymnastics staff got up early in the morning to hand it off to Ignacio Yakers' parents, who buckled it in their car, got it back down through the states, down through Kansas. It made a little pit stop at a rest stop to get gas, made it to Oklahoma where the athletes were, and just a funny story. Moving on to ECAC championships. So I thought without a shadow of a doubt that Navy was going to win ECAC championships. They had won 6 in a row. They were super dominant at the USAG championships, and I certainly expected them to win their 7th straight title. However, It was actually Army who came away victorious with their first title since 2016. I will say that despite Navy's loss, their star Isaiah Drake did take home the all-around title. Greenville rounded out that team podium in third. They were about a point ahead of Springville, and then William and Mary and Simpson rounded out the team competition. So Caleb Palacio of Springfield took their floor title. There was actually a tie for pommel horse between Matthew Roth of Greenville and Matthew Petros of Navy. Isaiah Drake took the Still Rings title. Ricky Mays of Greenville got the vault title. Matthew Petros took the parallel bar title, and Ricky Pizum took the high bar title. So I did take a look at the highest scores across the country this week, and while you certainly can't compare scores across different meets, these were the highest scores overall. So Michigan got the highest team score with a 330.75. All around was Frederick Richard with an 83.45. Taylor Burkhart had the highest floor with a 14.35. Patty Hoops had the highest pommel horse with a 14.9. Still Rings Asher Hung with a 14.8. Vault Cam Nelson with a 14.85. Ian Roybal parallel bars with a 14.6, and high bar Emery Dodonley with 14.3. And honestly, I would say that that's pretty close to who a lot of people think are going to win the national titles. I would say maybe sub Joshua Carnes for Ian Roybal on parallel bars. But aside from that, that's a pretty dang good list of who might be your NCAA champions. So some insights into the CGA awards this year. They posted the nominations today for Gymnast of the Year, Specialist of the Year, and Rookie of the Year. And I have some questions. So like when you look through these pages at first, you're like, oh, yay, celebrate everyone who got nominated. And then you start to look more closely and you're like, wow, there are some names that are missing. And so like as I'm looking closely more through it, this first came to my attention on the specialist page because I was like, why are Patty Hoops and Josh Carnes not on the specialist list? And as I was looking more closely, I realized that athletes from Penn State, Nebraska, Air Force, Simpson, and Greenville are completely missing from these lists. So I asked around and I did get some clarification from several people. So I will say allegedly, but I feel pretty confident with this, that allegedly several of those teams, if not all 5 of those teams, did not submit names on time for their athletes to be considered for these awards. So I have to be honest, I kind of hate this. I hate that an athlete or athletes are probably going to get punished because their coach messed up. That's not great. I kind of understand why you might want a coach's, I guess, recommendation for Gymnast of the Year, because Gymnast of the Year is not just, it's not something that you can just say by a metric that like, okay, they're the best gymnast. You also want to include things like, how is their leadership? Are they a good teammate? Things of that nature. And so those things aren't quantifiable. But for like Specialist of the Year, I would say that's fairly quantifiable. And like anyone with a brain could come up with a list of those. So I don't know, maybe CGA will revamp this process in the future, but I do feel for those athletes who were ultimately left off because their coach maybe forgot to push send on that button. Coming up, we have the Osijek World Cup this weekend. I do know that there was some confusion from the men's gymnastics community about where is Alex Diab, and because they saw photos of Riley Luce and Jean Iwe in Croatia and no Alex Diab. So what happened is Riley and Jean were competing at the DTB Cup in Germany, and they were not going to fly back to the States for like 2 days just to fly back to Croatia. So they just stayed on that time zone, and then Alex Diab has joined them in Croatia. You can see updates on Psych Caesar's Instagram, so follow along there. In some sad news, so Tin Surovich had to withdraw due to injury. Also, the Russians have withdrawn. So as you know, there was this whole debacle where the Russian athletes were not able to compete in international competition. Now the FIG has come back and said, okay, we will approve a few neutral athletes. So they went through this whole process to get neutral athletes approved. And now they've written a letter saying, like, we will not compete. And there's a couple of theories as to why this is. Now, one of their leaders wrote a letter saying that they were not granted visas for Croatia. Now, it's my understanding that they don't necessarily need visas for the final World Cup. So there is some question as to if that is the real reason or not. The FIG has written a response to the neutral athletes pulling out of competition, and you can read that on their website. Now, this competition is a little bit hard to preview just simply because athletes who are nominated are not necessarily always the athletes who show up. So I can't purposefully and fully preview this competition, but I can tell you that Jake Jarman is in Croatia, and he has been posting some of the greatest scale content I have ever seen in my entire life. So he is joining and up on that bandwagon. So he posted a video of him doing the Yanakura vault, which is equally the hardest vault in the world. And he said, who knew that the hardest part of gymnastics was ... standing still, and it shows him trying to do his scale, which I just find absolutely hilarious. And Jake Jarman, if you're listening to this podcast, I have some tips for you. One of which is to not find a place on the floor to spot. You have to look up a little bit higher and find a place to spot that is not just going to be the color blue, like you want to find a letter or a point on the wall or something like that. I also have some really good resources and people who you can talk to if you would like to improve your scale. But if you don't and you just want to keep creating hilarious content for us, we're here for that as well. So if you would like to help bring more live men's gymnastics coverage to life, please consider donating. A massive thank you to everyone who's been donating. We are almost entirely listener supported at this point, so these donations do make a difference. Thank you to everyone who has been writing in and doing the Apple podcast reviews. We really, really, really appreciate it. We're at 71 5-star reviews, which is huge. So thank you so much for doing that. If you have any questions, comments, or insider tips, you can email me at neutraldeductions@gmail.com. That's all for this week. We'll see you next time.